Hey there. Couldn't sleep? It's okay, you're in the right place, just a small favor. Did you know 89% watch without subscribing? If you enjoy this, I'd really appreciate your support. And let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Thanks for being here. I never believed in monsters until I became a park ranger in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My name is Alex, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the autumn of 2023, in the dense wilderness of the Hiawatha National Forest. Every word is true, every detail burned into my memory like a brand. Some nights I still wake up screaming. The first incident occurred 3 weeks after I transferred from my comfortable position in Yellowstone. My supervisor, Matthew, was a grizzled veteran with 30 years in the service. He had a way of looking past you when he spoke, as if seeing something in the distance that no one else could perceive. During my orientation, he warned me about the usual dangers: bears, wolves, hypothermia, lost hikers. But there was something else in his eyes, something he wouldn't name. It was Ezra, the maintenance supervisor, who first mentioned the reports. We were sitting in the ranger station on a cold October evening, rain hammering against the windows. The forest beyond was a wall of darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. "You hear about the campers they found last month?" Ezra asked, not looking up from his coffee. He was a thin man in his 50s with hands that never stopped moving. "Up near the Sturgeon River, I hadn't heard." Matthew had been careful about what information he shared with me. "They were experienced backpackers," Ezra continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Gabriel and Carter, brothers from Wisconsin. They'd been camping these woods for 15 years. Rangers found their campsite torn apart. The tent was shredded, not cut, but torn with something that left claw marks in the fabric. Their supplies were scattered across 100 yards of forest floor." "Bear attack?" I suggested, though even as I said it, something felt wrong. Ezra shook his head slowly. "That's what the official report says. But Isaac, the ranger who found them, he saw the tracks. Said they looked like dog prints, but massive, bigger than any wolf. And here's the thing that doesn't sit right. The tracks were sometimes four-legged, sometimes two-legged, like whatever made them could walk upright." The rain had stopped, and the silence that followed was oppressive. Ezra finally looked at me, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "There's something in these woods that shouldn't exist," he said. "Matthew knows it. We all know it. But nobody talks about it because the moment you say it out loud, you sound insane." 3 nights later, I encountered it myself. I was on a routine patrol along the western boundary, where the forest becomes truly wild and untouched. The sun had set an hour earlier, and I was following the trail with my flashlight, checking for signs of illegal camping. The beam of my light caught the trees in stark relief, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. That's when I heard the howl. It started low, almost below the range of hearing, a sound that made my chest vibrate. Then it rose, climbing in pitch until it became a shriek that split the night. It wasn't a wolf. I'd heard wolves before in Yellowstone and Alaska. This was different, more primal, more intelligent. It held notes that no animal should be able to produce, sounds that seemed almost like words twisted into a scream. The howl echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees, making it impossible to determine its origin. My hand went to the radio on my belt, but before I could call it in, I heard something else. Footsteps. They were moving through the underbrush to my right, heavy and deliberate. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed only trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking despite my efforts to sound authoritative. "This is National Park Service. Identify yourself." The response was a low growl that raised every hair on my body. It was close, maybe 30 feet away, but I still couldn't see anything. I took a step backward, keeping my light pointed toward the sound. That's when I saw the eyes. They were yellow, catching the light like a cat's, but positioned at least 7 feet off the ground. They stared at me with an intelligence that no animal should possess, studying me with what felt like malicious intent. As I watched, frozen in terror, the eyes moved. Not side to side, but up and down, as if whatever owned them was standing on 2 legs and had just shifted its weight. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but in that moment, every instinct I had screamed at me to flee. I turned and sprinted back down the trail, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly, catching glimpses of trees and rocks. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, but loping. moving through the forest with a fluid grace that shouldn't be possible for something so large. The sound of its pursuit was worse than seeing it. I could hear branches breaking under its weight, hear the heavy panting breath that seemed to come from lungs too large for any normal creature. And beneath it all, I swear I heard something else, a sound like laughter, low and cruel. I made it back to my truck in less than 5 minutes, though the trail was nearly 2 miles long. I don't remember most of the run, just the terror and the certain knowledge that if I fell, if I stumbled even once, I would never get back up. When I reached the parking area, I threw myself into the truck and locked the doors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I looked back toward the trail. It was standing at the tree line just beyond the reach of my headlights. Tall, impossibly tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the light. Its body was wrong, too long in the torso, with arms that hung past where its knees should be. The head was the worst part, canine, like a wolf or a large dog, but stretched and distorted, with a muzzle full of teeth that gleamed white in the darkness. It stood on 2 legs, perfectly balanced, watching me with those yellow eyes. Then, as I sat there in my truck with my foot frozen on the brake, it raised one massive hand, and I swear to God it waved. I drove back to the station going 60 miles an hour on roads meant for 30. When I burst through the door, I found Matthew and Jaden, one of the younger rangers, playing cards at the main desk. They took one look at my face and knew. "You saw it," Matthew said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak, my whole body shaking with adrenaline and fear. Jaden, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked at Matthew. "We need to tell him." Matthew was silent for a long moment, then he slowly nodded. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his desk drawer and poured 3 glasses. "What you saw tonight," he began, "has been spotted in these woods for over 100 years. The Ojibwe people who lived here before us, they had a name for it. Witiko-kan, the dog walker, though most people now call it the dogman. It's not the only thing out there, but it's one of the worst." He took a long drink before continuing. "There are places in this forest where the old world and the new world overlap, where things that shouldn't exist can cross over. The dogman is one of them. Some say it's a curse, a human who violated sacred laws and was transformed. Others say it's something that was here before humans, something ancient and hungry. Why doesn't anyone know about this?" I managed to ask. "Why isn't this public?" "Because people don't want to believe," Jaden said quietly. "And the ones who see it, who really see it, they either leave or they end up like Gabriel and Carter." Matthew pulled out a folder from his desk. Inside were incident reports going back decades. Mauled hikers, missing campers, strange tracks, photographs of massive claw marks on trees 8 feet off the ground, witness statements describing a creature that walked like a man but looked like a wolf. "The official stance is that these are all bear attacks, mountain lion sightings, mass hysteria," Matthew explained. "But we know different. Those of us who work these woods, who spend enough time out there, we all see it eventually, and once you've seen it, you're never the same." I spent that night in the station, unwilling to go back to my cabin alone. Outside, the forest was dark and silent, but I kept imagining I could see those yellow eyes staring in through the windows, watching and waiting. That was my introduction to the true nature of the American wilderness. I learned that night that the old stories, the legends that pioneers and Native Americans whispered around campfires, they weren't just stories, they were warnings, and my education was only beginning. The week following my encounter with the dogman, I threw myself into research. Matthew gave me access to the restricted files, documents that were never meant to be seen by the public. What I found there shook me to my core. Luca, a ranger who had worked in these forests during the 1980s, had kept meticulous records of anomalous incidents. His reports described tracks that couldn't exist, footprints 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, pressed so deep into the ground that whatever made them must have weighed at least 800 pounds. The stride length was sometimes 6 feet, suggesting a creature that stood 9 or 10 feet tall. Anthony, another veteran ranger from the 1990s, had photographed one of these tracks. The image showed a humanoid footprint, complete with 5 toes, but the proportions were all wrong. The heel was too broad, the toes too thick. It looked like a human foot but scaled up to nightmare proportions. In his report, Anthony noted that the tracks appeared suddenly in the middle of a clearing, with no approach trail, as if whatever made them had simply materialized. Dylan, who had transferred to Wyoming after only 2 years in Michigan, left behind a journal that I discovered in the archive. The final entry was dated 3 days before his transfer. His handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. "I saw it today," he wrote. "Not the dogman, but something else. I was on the North Trail near the old growth section when I noticed the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. The silence was absolute, oppressive. Then I smelled it, rot and decay like 1,000 dead animals left in the sun. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh, steam still rising from where they pressed into the frost. They led off the trail deeper into the forest. I didn't follow them. I will never follow them. I'm requesting a transfer tomorrow. Whatever's out there, it's watching us. It knows we're here. And I think it's getting bolder." Lincoln, the current chief ranger for the district, called me into his office 1 week after my encounter. He was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. "I've read Matthew's report about your incident," he began, gesturing for me to sit. "I want you to know that what you experienced is real and it's taken seriously, even if we can't acknowledge it publicly." "Why can't we?" I asked, frustration bleeding into my voice. "People are dying out there. If they knew what was really in these woods, they'd never come back," Lincoln interrupted. "And this forest, these parks, they'd be shut down. Millions of acres of wilderness closed to the public because of stories about monsters. Do you know what that would mean? Not just for tourism, but for conservation, for research, for the thousands of species that depend on this ecosystem." I understood his point, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. "Besides," Lincoln continued, "most people don't venture deep enough to encounter these things. The creatures, whatever they are, they avoid populated areas. It's only those who go into the true wilderness, the places where humans rarely tread, who are at risk." He opened a drawer and pulled out a map of the forest. Large sections were marked with red ink. "These are the high-risk zones," he explained. "Areas where encounters are most frequent. We try to discourage hiking in these regions, put up signs about bear activity, close trails for maintenance, but we can't fence off the entire forest." The map showed 3 distinct red zones. The largest was in the northwestern section, a remote area accessible only by unmarked trails. The second was near the center, around an area known as the Desolation Wilderness. The third was to the east following the Sturgeon River Valley. "The northwestern zone," Lincoln said, pointing to the map. "That's dogman territory. Whatever you encountered, it's been spotted there for decades. The central zone, Desolation Wilderness, that's different. The reports from there are stranger. People who go in sometimes don't come out. And those who do, they're changed. They talk about seeing massive figures in the trees, about hearing voices, about feeling watched by something ancient and malevolent." "Bigfoot?" I asked, though saying the word out loud felt ridiculous. Lincoln nodded slowly. "That's what some call it. The Ojibwe called it Jimakweju, the giant. There have been sightings in North America for hundreds of years. Most are hoaxes, misidentifications, people seeing what they want to see, but not all of them. Some of the reports, especially from these woods, they're too consistent, too detailed to dismiss." He pulled out another file, this one containing photographs. The images showed massive structures made of twisted trees, arranged in patterns that couldn't be natural. Some were teepee-like formations with logs 12 feet long leaned against each other. Others were flat structures, trees laid across boulders in ways that would require incredible strength. "Thomas found these last year," Lincoln explained. Thomas was a backcountry ranger who specialized in wilderness survival. He was doing a survey in Desolation Wilderness when he came across an entire area of forest that had been altered. Trees broken in half, laid out in geometric patterns. The structures were fresh, made within the previous week. Whatever created them has intelligence, purpose. I studied the photographs, feeling a chill run down my spine. The structures weren't random. They looked like territorial markers or perhaps warnings. "And the third zone?" I asked, pointing to the area along the Sturgeon River. Lincoln's expression darkened. "That's the worst one. That's where we've had the disappearances. People go in for a hike or a fishing trip and they vanish. Sometimes we find their camps abandoned with food still on the plates, gear still packed. It's like they just walked away in the middle of dinner and never came back." He pulled out one final document, and I recognized it immediately. It was a copy of an old manuscript, written in French. The title roughly translated to Account of the Wendigo Curse. French fur trappers in the 1700s, Lincoln said, They encountered something in these woods that terrified them so badly. Most of them abandoned their trap lines and returned to Canada. They called it the Wendigo, an evil spirit that possessed humans and turned them into cannibalistic monsters. The Algonquian tribes had known about it for centuries. They said the Wendigo was born from taboo, from the violation of natural law, and that once it possessed you, you were lost forever, consumed by an insatiable hunger. You're saying there's a Wendigo in these woods? The words sounded insane even as I said them. I'm saying there's something in that third zone that drives people mad, Lincoln replied. Maverick, one of our rangers, he spent 2 nights lost in that area 5 years ago. When we found him, he'd lost 40 pounds and was completely incoherent. It took him 3 months to recover enough to speak coherently. He described hearing voices in his head, telling him to do terrible things. He said the forest itself felt wrong, twisted as if the trees were watching him with malice. He resigned the day after he was released from the hospital. Lincoln closed all the files and looked at me directly. I'm telling you this because you've seen one of them now. You're part of the club, as Matthew calls it. Those of us who know the truth. And I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. These things are real, they're dangerous, and they're not going away. Our job is to protect the public, but we can't tell them what we're protecting them from. We can only do our best to keep them out of the danger zones and hope that's enough. I left his office with my mind reeling. The world I thought I knew, the rational, ordered world of science and logic, had been revealed as a thin veneer over something much darker and more primal. That night, I decided to read through more of the old reports. Elias, a ranger from the 1960s, had documented an encounter in the central zone that sent chills through me. It was October, his report read, and I was tracking what I thought was a lost hiker. The footprints were large, but I assumed it was a man in boots. I followed the trail for 2 hours deeper into the forest than I had ever been. The tracks led me to a clearing where the trees had been stripped of bark in a ring around the perimeter. In the center of the clearing was a structure made of logs arranged in a dome shape. The smell was overwhelming, musk like a wet dog but amplified 100 times. I approached the structure and looked inside. What I saw there I will never speak of again. I only know that I ran and I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I submitted my resignation the next morning. Whatever Elias had seen in that structure had affected him so deeply that he refused to ever discuss it again. He'd moved to Florida and taken a job as a guidance counselor, as far from the wilderness as he could get. Josiah, another ranger from the same era, had his own terrifying account from the Sturgeon River zone. He'd been following up on a report of a missing fisherman when he'd found the man's campsite. Everything was intact, the tent, the fishing gear, the cooler full of food, but the fisherman himself was gone. What disturbed Josiah most were the marks he'd found on the trees surrounding the camp. They looked like they'd been carved with something sharp, and they formed symbols that he recognized from his research into Native American culture. They were warnings, signs that meant cursed ground and evil place. I felt it as soon as I entered that camp, Josiah wrote. A presence, something watching from the trees. The air was cold, unnaturally so, even though it was August. I heard whispers, too faint to make out words, but I knew they were speaking to me, trying to tell me something. Or perhaps trying to lure me deeper into the forest. I gathered the fisherman's belongings and left as quickly as possible. We never found him. I don't think we ever will. I spent the next week in a state of constant unease. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound in the night made me reach for my weapon. I started sleeping with the lights on, something I hadn't done since I was a child. Charles, a ranger who'd recently transferred in from Montana, noticed my behavior. We were having lunch in the station cafeteria when he brought it up. "You look like you haven't slept in days," he observed. "Let me guess. You had an encounter?" I nodded, grateful to have someone to talk to who wouldn't think I was insane. "It gets easier," Charles said, though his eyes suggested otherwise. "You learn to live with the knowledge. You learn to respect the boundaries, to recognize the signs when something is nearby, but it never stops being scary. The moment you stop being afraid is the moment you become careless, and carelessness in these woods gets you killed." He told me about his own experience, an encounter in the Montana wilderness with what he described as a family group of large bipedal creatures. He'd watched them from a ridge, observing through binoculars as they moved through a valley. The creatures were covered in dark hair, stood between 8 and 10 feet tall, and moved with a coordination that suggested intelligence and social structure. The young one, the smallest of the group, it looked right at me, Charles said, his voice dropping. Even though I was a quarter-mile away, hidden in the trees, it knew I was there. It pointed at me, and the others turned to look. For a moment, we all just stared at each other. Then the largest one, the one I assume was the father, it made a sound, like a roar, but with words hidden in it, as if it was trying to communicate. They turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest. I packed up my gear and left that mountain that same day. These stories, these accounts from rangers who had witnessed the impossible, they all had a common thread. The creatures were intelligent, they were territorial, and they were becoming bolder. Whatever barrier had once kept them hidden in the deepest wilderness was breaking down. 3 weeks after my encounter with the dogman, I was assigned to investigate a new report. A group of hunters had called in a sighting of unusual tracks near the northern boundary. I drove out with Caleb, another ranger who'd been with the service for 10 years but had never had an encounter himself. We found the tracks exactly where the hunters had described. They were massive, 18 inches long with a stride of nearly 6 feet. The impressions were so deep that whatever made them had sunk 3 inches into the hard-packed earth. Caleb knelt beside one of the tracks, his face pale. "This is impossible," he muttered. "Nothing should be able to make a print this deep. The ground here is like concrete." I took photographs and measurements while Caleb followed the trail. The tracks led away from the hunting area, deeper into the forest, heading toward the central zone marked on Lincoln's map. "We should follow them," Caleb said, though his voice wavered. "Document where they go." Every instinct I had screamed against the idea, but Caleb was right. This was our job, to investigate, to document, to understand. We followed the tracks for over an hour, moving deeper into the wilderness. The forest around us grew denser, older. The trees here were enormous, some of them at least 200 years old. The canopy blocked most of the sunlight, leaving the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The tracks led us to a section of forest, where the undergrowth had been cleared away, leaving bare earth in a rough circle about 30 feet in diameter. In the center of the circle stood 3 trees that had been twisted together, their trunks braided like rope. The trees were living, still covered in leaves, but they'd been manipulated into this impossible formation. "What the hell?" Caleb whispered. Around the edge of the clearing we found more structures. Carefully arranged piles of stones, bones hung from branches, and patterns carved into tree bark. The symbols weren't random. They had meaning, purpose. That's when we heard it. A low, resonant call that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was answered by another call, this one from our left, then another from our right. We were surrounded. Caleb grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." We backed away from the clearing, keeping our eyes on the tree line. As we retreated, I caught glimpses of movement. Large, dark shapes moving through the trees, pacing us, staying just out of clear sight. The calls continued, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't aggressive, not exactly. They felt more like warnings. A clear message: you are not welcome here. We made it back to our truck without incident, but the entire way, I felt eyes on us, watching our every move. When we finally reached the vehicle and climbed inside, I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, easily 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair. It stood perfectly still, watching us with an intelligence that was undeniable. Caleb saw it too. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "It's real. It's all real." The creature watched us for a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural. Within seconds, it had vanished into the shadows. We drove back to the station in silence. What could we say? We'd just confirmed the existence of something that science said couldn't exist. We'd seen, with our own eyes, evidence of an intelligence that shouldn't be possible in anything other than humans. That night I wrote my report, carefully documenting everything we'd found and seen. I knew it would be filed away with the others, hidden in the restricted archives, never to be made public. But I needed to record it, to make sure that someone, somewhere, would know the truth. The American wilderness holds secrets that most people will never know. And after what I'd seen, I wasn't sure that was such a bad thing. Some knowledge is too terrible to share. Some truths are too frightening to speak aloud. But the encounters were far from over. The worst was yet to come. 2 months into my assignment, I volunteered for a search and rescue operation in the Desolation Wilderness, the central zone on Lincoln's map. 3 hikers, Christopher, Ezekiel, and Miles, had failed to return from a 5-day backpacking trip. Their families had reported them missing after they didn't show up at their designated pickup point. It had been 4 days since anyone had heard from them. The search team consisted of 6 rangers: myself, Jackson, Isaiah, Andrew, Joshua, and Nathan. We were equipped with GPS, satellite phones, emergency supplies, and enough provisions for a week-long search. Lincoln briefed us before we headed out. The last known location of the missing hikers was at the north end of the Desolation Wilderness, near Copper Falls, he said, pointing to a spot on the map. They were expected to loop around through the valley and exit at the southern trailhead. When they didn't show up, the family used the tracking app on Christopher's phone to locate them. The signal puts them approximately here. He indicated a location deep in the heart of the wilderness, miles from any established trail. Why would they go so far off course? Andrew asked. He was a seasoned ranger, approaching 50 with a no-nonsense attitude that I respected. Unknown, Lincoln replied. But I want everyone to stay alert. This is the zone with the highest number of anomalous incidents. Work in pairs at all times, and if you see or hear anything unusual, report it immediately. We set out at dawn, hiking in 3 pairs along the established trails, until we reached the general area of the hikers' last known location. The forest here was different from the areas I'd patrolled before. The trees were older, more densely packed. The underbrush was thick with ferns and moss, and the ground was soft, almost spongy beneath our boots. The air had a weight to it, a pressure that made breathing feel labored. Jackson and I were paired together. He was in his early 30s, lean and athletic, with years of wilderness experience. As we hiked, I noticed him constantly scanning the tree line, his hand never far from the bear spray on his belt. "You feel it too?" he asked after about an hour of hiking. "Feel what?" I replied, though I knew exactly what he meant. "Like we're being watched, like the forest itself is aware of us," I nodded. The sensation had been growing stronger with each step we took deeper into the wilderness. It wasn't just the normal alertness that comes from being in wild country. This was something else, something that set my nerves on edge and made my skin crawl. We found the first sign of the missing hikers around midday. It was a bandana, red and white checked, caught on a branch about 8 feet off the ground. The fabric was torn as if it had been ripped from someone's neck. Jackson radioed the others while I examined the area. There were tracks here, boot prints heading deeper into the forest, moving fast. The stride length suggested someone running, but there were other tracks too. Larger prints that I recognized, the same 18-inch humanoid footprints I'd seen weeks earlier. They were being chased, I said to Jackson. He came over to look at the tracks, his face grim. "We need to call Lincoln. This is bad." Before he could reach for his radio, we heard a sound from deeper in the forest, a scream. High-pitched and terrified, cut off abruptly. It was human, unmistakably so, and it came from the direction the tracks were heading. Isaiah and Nathan reached us first, running from their search sector. They'd heard the scream too. "We have to go after them," Isaiah said. He was young, maybe 26, and still had the idealistic notion that we could save everyone. "Wait for the others," Jackson cautioned, but Isaiah was already moving, following the tracks deeper into the wilderness. Nathan hesitated for a moment, then followed. Jackson cursed and keyed his radio. "All units, we have a scream from the southeast sector. Isaiah and Nathan are pursuing, converging on their location." We ran after them, following the trail through increasingly dense forest. The canopy overhead thickened until we were running in near darkness, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the gloom. The tracks led us to a ravine, a deep cut in the earth about 30 feet wide. At the bottom, we could see the remains of a camp, a torn tent, scattered supplies, a backpack split open with its contents spilled across the rocks. Isaiah was already climbing down the steep wall of the ravine. "I see one of them," he called up. "He's alive." We descended carefully, using roots and rocks for handholds. At the bottom, we found Christopher. He was huddled against the ravine wall, his clothes torn and filthy, his face gaunt and covered in scratches. When he saw us, his eyes went wide with terror, and he scrambled backward. "No, no, no," he babbled. "You can't be here. It'll know. It'll come for you, too." "Christopher, it's okay," Isaiah said, approaching slowly with his hands up. "We're park rangers. We're here to rescue you." "There's no rescue," Christopher said, his voice breaking. "Miles is dead. Ezekiel is gone. It took them. It took them in the night." "What took them?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Christopher looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Complete and utter madness. The look of someone who had seen something that broke their mind. "The giant," he whispered. "The giant that walks like a man. It came to our camp 3 nights ago. We heard it first moving through the forest, breaking branches, making sounds like it was talking to itself. We thought it was a bear, so we made noise, tried to scare it away. But then we saw it. He started shaking, his whole body trembling with remembered terror. It stood at the edge of the firelight, just watching us. It was huge, taller than any man, covered in brown hair. Its face looked almost human, but wrong. Too flat, with eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. We ran. God help us, we ran. But Miles, he tripped, fell down into this ravine. The creature followed. It came down the wall, climbing like it weighed nothing. Miles was screaming, begging us to help, but we ran. We abandoned him. Tears streamed down Christopher's face. We heard him screaming for hours, heard him begging for help. Then the screams stopped. When we came back in the morning, we found pieces of him. Bones. The creature had torn him apart. Andrew and Joshua arrived, descending into the ravine. Andrew took one look at Christopher and immediately radioed for an emergency extraction. "We need to get him out of here now," Andrew said. "He's in shock, possibly hypothermic." "What about Ezekiel?" Nathan asked. Christopher laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Ezekiel went looking for help. Said he'd follow the ravine to the river, then follow the river out. That was 2 days ago. He's dead. They're all dead." As we prepared to move Christopher out of the ravine, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The walls of the ravine were covered in scratch marks, deep gouges in the rock that looked like they'd been made by enormous fingers. And there were bones scattered among the rocks, bones that looked too large to be from any native wildlife, and bones that looked disturbingly human. This wasn't just a place where something lived. This was a killing ground, a place where the creature brought its prey. Jackson saw what I was looking at. "We need to leave, now." As we began the climb back up the ravine wall, helping Christopher between us, I heard it. A low, rumbling call from somewhere above us. It was answered by another call from the opposite direction. They were communicating, coordinating. We were being hunted. Andrew, who was in the lead, reached the top of the ravine first. He turned to help pull Nathan up, and that's when he saw it. His face went white, and he stumbled backward. "Oh, God," he whispered. Standing at the edge of the ravine, not 20 feet away, was a creature that shouldn't exist. It stood at least 9 feet tall, maybe taller. Its body was covered in reddish-brown hair, thick and matted. The arms were impossibly long, reaching almost to its knees. The face was the most disturbing part. Humanoid, with a flat nose and deep-set eyes, but the proportions were all wrong, too elongated, with a heavy brow ridge that cast the eyes in shadow. It stared down at us, and I could feel its intelligence, its awareness. This wasn't an animal. This was something else, something that thought and planned and understood that we were trapped. Isaiah, in a moment of panic, reached for his bear spray. The creature's response was immediate and terrifying. It opened its mouth and released a sound that shook my bones. A roar that started low and climbed in pitch until it became almost ultrasonic. A sound that made my ears ring and my vision blur. The message was clear. "Do not threaten me." We froze, not daring to move. The creature watched us for what felt like an eternity. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for something so large. The moment it was gone, We scrambled out of the ravine, moving as fast as we dared while helping Christopher. Nobody spoke. We were all too terrified, too focused on putting distance between us and that place. We'd gone maybe half a mile when Nathan suddenly stopped. "Where's Isaiah?" he asked. We all turned. Isaiah, who had been behind us helping support Christopher, was gone. "Isaiah," Jackson called out. "Isaiah, where are you?" There was no response. The forest was silent, oppressively so. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of our own ragged breathing. "We have to go back," Nathan said. "No," Andrew replied firmly. "We get Christopher out, then we come back with a full search team." "We can't just leave him," Nathan protested. Before anyone could respond, we heard Isaiah's voice, distant and muffled, calling for help. It came from back toward the ravine, from the direction we'd just come. Joshua and I started moving toward the sound, but Andrew grabbed my arm. "Wait!" he hissed. "Listen," I strained to hear. Isaiah's voice came again, calling for help, but there was something wrong with it. The pitch was off, the words too clear for how far away it sounded. And it kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "Help me, help me, help me." "That's not Isaiah," Andrew said quietly. "That's something imitating Isaiah." The calls continued, always from the same distance, never getting closer or farther away. They were trying to lure us back, trying to separate us. "We move now," Andrew ordered. "Fast but quiet, and nobody responds to any calls, no matter who you think it is." We ran, half carrying Christopher between us. Behind us, the calls changed. They became angry, frustrated, cycling through different voices. I heard Isaiah's voice, then Miles' voice, then voices I didn't recognize. The creature was using sounds it had learned, trying to trigger our rescue instincts. As we fled through the darkening forest, I caught glimpses of movement in the trees, multiple large shapes pacing us, staying just out of clear sight. There wasn't just one creature. There were several working together to hurt us. We burst onto an established trail just as the sun was setting. The moment we stepped onto the maintained path, the pursuit stopped. I looked back and saw them. 3 enormous figures standing at the tree line, watching us leave their territory. They made no move to follow us onto the trail. We made it back to the staging area after nightfall. Christopher was immediately evacuated to the hospital, and a full search team was organized to look for Isaiah. But deep down, we all knew he was gone. The official report stated that Isaiah had become separated from the group and was lost in the wilderness. His body was never found. Christopher was diagnosed with severe psychological trauma and spent 6 months in psychiatric care before he could function normally again. He never spoke about what happened in the Desolation Wilderness, refusing all interviews and questions. And me. I learned that there are places in the American wilderness where humans are no longer the apex predators, where ancient things still rule, and where the boundaries between legend and reality are far thinner than anyone wants to believe. But the horror wasn't over. The worst encounter, the one that would change everything, was still to come. After losing Isaiah in the Desolation Wilderness, the atmosphere at the ranger station changed. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were no longer just dealing with isolated incidents. Something was happening in the forest, something that was getting worse. Lincoln called a meeting with all the senior rangers, Matthew, Andrew, Jackson, and myself. We gathered in his office after hours, the blinds drawn, speaking in low voices. "We have a problem," Lincoln began. "In the last 6 months, we've had 12 missing persons cases in these forests. 12. That's more than we've had in the previous 5 years combined. And it's not just our district. I've been talking to rangers from surrounding areas. Adrian from the Superior National Forest, Cameron from the Ottawa, Santiago from the Northern Territories. They're all reporting the same thing. An increase in disappearances, an increase in sightings, an increase in aggressive behavior. The creatures are moving," Matthew said quietly. "My grandfather told me stories about times like this. Periods when the boundaries between their world and ours become thin. He said it happens every few generations, that something in the natural balance shifts." "What are you suggesting?" Andrew asked. "I'm suggesting that we're in the middle of one of those shifts right now," Matthew replied. "And if the old stories are true, it's going to get worse before it gets better." Lincoln pulled out a new map, this one showing the entire Upper Peninsula. He'd marked dozens of incident locations with red dots. The pattern was clear. The incidents were clustering around the 3 zones he'd shown me before, but they were also spreading outward, moving closer to populated areas. 2 weeks ago, Lincoln said, a family camping at the Perch Lake campground reported seeing a large, hair-covered figure walking through the campsites at night. Last week, a couple driving on Highway 41 claimed they saw something massive cross the road in front of their car. Yesterday, Nolan found tracks less than a mile from the town of Wetmore. They're leaving the deep wilderness, I said. They're coming closer to civilization. Exactly, Lincoln confirmed. And that means the risk of a major incident, something we can't hide or explain away, is increasing exponentially. Jackson leaned forward. What do we do? We can't exactly tell people the truth. Lincoln was quiet for a moment, then he said, we increase patrols in the populated areas. We close more trails. We do everything we can to keep people away from the danger zones, and we prepare for the possibility that all of this is going to become public knowledge. That meeting took place on a Friday. By Monday, everything had changed. It started with a call from the sheriff's office. A group of teenagers, Eli, Aaron, Ryan, and Angel, had gone camping in the Sturgeon River Valley, the 3rd zone on Lincoln's map. When they didn't return home Sunday night, their parents had filed a missing persons report. The sheriff was organizing a search party. Lincoln immediately assembled a team. Myself, Jackson, Cooper, Waylon, Easton, and Kai. We met the sheriff, Christian, at the northern access point to the valley. He was a tall man in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. The boys are experienced campers, Christian told us. All of them have been coming to these woods since they were kids. They know the rules, know how to take care of themselves. If they're missing, something's wrong. We hiked into the valley following the trail the boys would have taken. The forest here felt different from the desolation wilderness. There was a coldness to the air that had nothing to do with temperature, a sense of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Cooper, who was the team's tracking specialist, found the boys' campsite about 3 miles in. The tents were still standing, but the campsite had been abandoned in haste. Food was left out, sleeping bags were scattered, and there were signs of a struggle. Look at this, Cooper called out. He was kneeling beside one of the tents, examining something on the ground. I walked over and felt my stomach turn. There were tracks everywhere, boot prints from the teenagers, but also other prints, impossible prints. They looked like human footprints, but they were enormous, easily 14 inches long, and they were wrong. The toes were too long, too claw-like. They didn't look like they belonged to anything that should exist. What the hell are those? Christian asked, staring at the tracks. Before anyone could answer, we heard a sound from deeper in the forest. A scream, raw and terrified, unmistakably human. That's Eli. One of the other searchers, Landon, shouted. He was Eli's older brother. We ran toward the sound, following it through the dense underbrush. The scream came again, closer now, but there was something wrong with it. It held a note of agony that made my blood run cold. We burst into a small clearing and found Eli. He was sitting against a tree, his clothes torn and covered in blood. His face was a mask of terror and his eyes were unfocused, staring at nothing. Landon rushed to his brother's side. Eli, can you hear me? Eli's head slowly turned toward Landon, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It's still here. It never left. It's watching us. What's watching us? Landon asked. What happened? The hungry one, Eli said, his voice taking on a strange sing-song quality. The one that walks like us but isn't us. The one that wanted us to know it's real, that it's always been real. Christian called for medical evacuation while the rest of us secured the area. Easton and Kai began a systematic search of the surrounding forest, looking for any sign of the other 3 boys. I stayed with Eli and Landon, trying to keep Eli calm until the emergency team arrived. But the more I looked at him, the more disturbed I became. His pupils were dilated and his skin was cold and clammy despite the warm day. The blood on his clothes wasn't his. He had no visible injuries, but there was something in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Eli, I said gently. Where are Aaron, Ryan, and Angel? Eli's head swiveled toward me with an unnatural smoothness. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It was deeper, more resonant. They're with the hungry one now. It took them in the night, one by one. It whispered to them, called them into the forest. And they went, because when it calls, you have to answer. You have to go. What do you mean it called them? I asked. Eli smiled, and it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. It can sound like anyone. It learned our voices, our words. It called to Ryan, and Aaron's voice said he was hurt, needed help. When Ryan went to look, it took him. Then it used Ryan's voice to call Angel. Then it used Angel's voice to call Aaron. And I sat in my tent, too afraid to move, listening to my friends die. "Why didn't it take you?" Jackson asked. Eli's smile widened. "Because it wanted someone to tell the story. It wanted someone to spread the fear. That's how it survives, you see. On fear, on terror, on the knowledge that something is out there in the dark. Something that hunger for your flesh and your soul." Landon grabbed his brother's shoulders. "Eli, stop it. You're scaring me." But Eli kept talking, his voice growing stronger. "It showed itself to me. Let me see what it really is. Not an animal, not a man, but something in between. Something that was human once, maybe, before the hunger took it. Before it became more than human. Less than human. The Wendigo, the Algonquian called it. The spirit of starvation and greed and cannibal hunger." Kai called out from the tree line. "I found something." We ran over to where he was standing. 20 feet into the forest, there was a trail of disturbed earth and broken branches. And there were bones. Human bones picked clean, scattered across the forest floor. Christian looked like he was going to be sick. Those boys. Those could be those boys. Cooper was examining the bones with a practiced eye. "These aren't fresh," he said. "Some of these have been here for months, maybe years. This is a feeding site. Whatever is out here, it's been using this area for a long time." We heard it then. A sound from deeper in the forest. A low moan that rose in pitch until it became a wail. It sounded almost human, but wrong, twisted with hunger and rage. Eli started laughing. "It knows we're here. It knows, and it's coming. It's always coming." The emergency helicopter arrived 15 minutes later, and we evacuated Eli immediately. But as they loaded him into the helicopter, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "It's spreading," he whispered urgently, his lucidity suddenly returning. "Whatever's happening, it's not just here. Christian told me stories about other places, other forests. The creatures are everywhere, and they're waking up. Something's wrong with the world, and they know it. They're preparing." The helicopter took off, and we resumed our search for the other 3 boys. We found Angel 2 hours later, or what was left of him. His body was partially buried in a shallow grave, torn apart by something with immense strength and fury. The official cause of death would be listed as a bear attack, but we all knew better. We never found Aaron or Ryan. Their bodies simply vanished, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The case remains open. 2 more names added to the long list of people who entered the American wilderness and never came back. That night, back at the station, Lincoln called another emergency meeting. The situation was becoming untenable. We couldn't keep covering up the incidents, couldn't keep explaining away the disappearances and deaths. "We need help," Lincoln said. "Real help. Anthropologists, biologists, people who specialize in cryptozoology. We need experts who can study these creatures, try to understand them." "And how do we explain that to the public?" Andrew asked. "How do we tell people that monsters are real without causing mass panic?" "We don't," Matthew said quietly. "Not yet. But we need to prepare for the possibility that this secret won't stay secret much longer. And when the truth comes out, when people finally believe, we need to have answers for them." Roman, a ranger who'd been quiet during most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "What if the answer is that we can't coexist? What if these creatures, whatever they are territorial and aggressive by nature? What if the only solution is to drive them out or eliminate them?" The room fell silent. The idea of hunting these creatures, of engaging in some kind of war with them, was something none of us wanted to consider. But the question hung in the air. Could we coexist with creatures that saw humans as prey? "We're not there yet," Lincoln said firmly. "Right now, our priority is protecting the public and gathering information. We increase patrols, we close more areas, and we document everything. Every sighting, every track, every piece of evidence. If this does go public, we need to be ready with data, not speculation." As the meeting broke up, Jackson pulled me aside. "There's something I haven't told anyone," he said quietly. 3 days ago, I was on patrol in the northwestern zone, near where you had your dogman encounter. I found a structure like the ones Thomas documented in the Desolation Wilderness. But this one was different. It wasn't just stacked logs. It was intricate, purposeful, and in the center there were symbols carved into the ground. I took photographs. He pulled out his phone and showed me the images. The symbols were complex geometric patterns that looked almost like writing. They weren't random scratches. They had structure, meaning. If these creatures can communicate through symbolic language, I said, then they're more intelligent than we thought. Much more intelligent, Jackson nodded grimly. And if they're that intelligent, then we're not just dealing with dangerous animals. We're dealing with a rival intelligence, one that's been living in these forests hidden from us for centuries, maybe millennia. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Eli's words. They're waking up. They're preparing. Preparing for what? What did these creatures know that we didn't? I got up and went back to the restricted archives, pulling files at random, looking for patterns, for clues. And I found something that chilled me to the core. There was a report from 1952, written by a ranger named Hunter. He'd been patrolling the Canadian border when he'd encountered a group of Ojibwe elders performing some kind of ceremony in the forest. When he asked what they were doing, they told him they were reinforcing the old boundaries, the sacred spaces that kept the spirits contained. They told me that the boundaries were weakening, Hunter wrote in his report. They said that as humans moved farther from the old ways, as we forgot the old stories and stopped respecting the sacred places, the barriers between worlds were breaking down. They said that if we didn't remember, if we didn't maintain the boundaries, the old ones would return, and when they returned, there would be blood. I looked at the date of Hunter's report, October 15, 1952. Exactly 73 years ago, almost to the day. Whatever cycle the creatures were on, whatever had kept them hidden and dormant for decades, it was ending, and we were about to face the full force of their return. The question was, would we survive it? The incident with Eli and the missing boys sparked a crisis that could no longer be contained. The media had gotten wind of the story, and although the official explanation was still bear attack, people were starting to ask questions. Why were there so many bear attacks suddenly? Why were so many people disappearing in these particular forests? Local news outlets started running stories about the dangerous wildlife in the Upper Peninsula. Tourists canceled their camping trips. The few who still came to the parks were nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders. The forest, which had once been a place of beauty and recreation, was becoming a place of fear. 3 weeks after the Sturgeon River incident, I received a call from Jonathan, a ranger from the neighboring district. He and I had gone through training together, and he was one of the few people outside my immediate team who I'd talked to about the creatures. "You need to come up to my sector," he said, his voice tense. "We've found something you need to see." I drove up the next morning with Connor and Micah, 2 rangers who'd recently been read in on the situation. The drive took 3 hours, taking us deeper into the wilderness to areas where human presence was minimal. Jonathan met us at a remote staging area, his face pale and drawn. "I've been a ranger for 15 years, he said without preamble. "I've seen a lot of strange things. But this is different." He led us on a 2-hour hike into the forest to an area so remote that the nearest road was 10 miles away. As we walked, I noticed that the forest was utterly silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of our boots on the trail. "It started a week ago," Jonathan explained. "We got reports from some backcountry campers about strange lights in this area. Glowing eyes, they said, dozens of them, moving through the trees at night. We thought it was probably just deer or some other wildlife, but we sent someone to check it out. Jeremiah, one of my best rangers, he didn't come back. We found Jeremiah's campsite intact but abandoned. His tent was still standing, his gear still packed. But Jeremiah himself was gone. We found him 2 days later," Jonathan said quietly, 3 miles from his camp deep in the forest. He was alive, but he trailed off, unable to continue. "But what?" I asked. "He'd been changed, physically changed. His body temperature was down to 86 degrees, but he wasn't hypothermic. His heart rate was at 30 beats per minute, but he was conscious and alert. And his eyes," Jonathan shuddered. "His eyes had changed color. They were yellow like an animal's." "Where is he now?" Connor asked. "Medical facility in Marquette. They're running tests, trying to figure out what happened to him. But the doctors are baffled. They've never seen anything like it." Jonathan led us farther into the forest, to the place where they'd found Jeremiah. It was a clearing, similar to the ones I'd seen before, but larger. And in the center of the clearing was something that made my blood run cold. It was a structure, but unlike any I'd seen before. It stood 15 feet tall, made of logs and branches woven together in an intricate pattern. The structure was shaped like a cone, with an opening at the base. And inside we could see bones. Human bones, animal bones, all arranged in careful patterns. "This is a shrine," Micah whispered. "They're building shrines." Around the clearing, we found more evidence of intelligence. Carefully arranged stones, symbols carved into trees, and what looked like tools, primitive but effective, made from sharpened rocks and hardened wood. "They're not just surviving in these forests," I said. "They're living here, building a culture. This isn't a group of isolated creatures. This is a society." As if in response to my words, we heard it. A howl from the forest, long and mournful. It was answered by others from different directions, creating a chorus of sound that echoed through the trees. "We need to leave," Jonathan said. "Now." But as we turned to go, I saw them. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, at least a dozen of them. Tall figures covered in dark hair standing on two legs, watching us with eyes that gleamed with intelligence and something else. Recognition. One of them stepped forward. It was massive, easily 10 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms that hung to its knees. Its face was remarkably human despite the hair and the heavy brow. And when it looked at me, I felt a shock of connection, as if it was truly seeing me, understanding me. The creature reached down and picked up a stone. For a moment I thought it was going to throw it, but instead, it placed the stone carefully on the ground between us. Then it stepped back and waited. "It's offering communication," Micah breathed. "It wants to talk." Slowly, carefully, I stepped forward. I picked up a stone of my own and placed it next to the one the creature had set down. The creature's eyes widened slightly, and I heard a sound from it that might have been approval. For several minutes we engaged in this strange exchange, building a small cairn together, stone by stone. It was primitive, but it was communication, a bridge between two species that could not, exist together. When the cairn was complete, the creature reached into the fur on its chest and pulled out something that it placed on top of the cairn. It was a pendant, carved from bone, shaped like a human figure. Then the creature and its group turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as silently as they'd appeared. I picked up the pendant and examined it. The carving was crude but recognizable, a human figure standing upright with arms outstretched. But around the figure were other shapes, taller shapes, protective shapes. "What does it mean?" Connor asked. I paused, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. "I think it means they remember us. Remember when humans and these creatures coexisted, before we forgot about them, before we stopped believing." We returned to the station with the pendant and a complete documentation of the site. Lincoln immediately convened an emergency meeting with senior staff from multiple districts. What we'd discovered was too significant to keep localized. Adam, the regional director, flew in from Washington to attend the meeting. He was a bureaucrat through his core, more concerned with liability and public perception than the truth. But even he couldn't deny the evidence we'd compiled. "We have documented proof of multiple encounters with bipedal, intelligent creatures across 5 districts," Lincoln presented. "We have physical evidence, tracks, structures, tools. We have first-hand accounts from dozens of trained rangers, and now we have an apparent attempt at communication. Gentlemen, we can't keep pretending this isn't happening." "What are you suggesting?" Adam asked, his voice tight. "I'm suggesting we need to go public," Lincoln said, in a controlled way with scientific backing. "We bring in anthropologists, zoologists, experts who can study these creatures properly. We acknowledge their existence and work on establishing protocols for coexistence." "That's insane," Adam responded. "The moment we admit these things exist, there will be panic. People will demand the forest be closed, or worse, they'll demand we hunt these creatures to extinction." "And if we don't go public?" Matthew interjected. "If we keep covering this up, keep letting people wander into these forests unprepared, how many more people have to die before we admit the truth?" The argument continued for hours. In the end, a compromise was reached. A small team of scientists would be brought in under strict confidentiality agreements to study the phenomena. If they could provide definitive proof, if they could confirm what we already knew, then they would explore ways to make the information public. Aiden, a biologist from the University of Michigan, was the first scientist brought onto the project. He arrived 2 weeks later, skeptical but open-minded. I was assigned to be his guide. "I've seen the reports," he said as we drove out to the research site Jonathan had showed me. "I've seen the photographs, the plaster casts of the tracks, but I need to see it with my own eyes. I need proof that can withstand scientific scrutiny. We spent a week in the forest, setting up camera traps, collecting samples, documenting everything. And then on the 7th night, we got our proof. It was past midnight when the motion sensors triggered. Aiden and I were in our observation tent, monitoring the equipment when the cameras activated. On the screen, we watched as a group of 3 creatures entered the clearing. They were massive, at least 9 feet tall, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for their size. The creatures approached one of the structures we'd been studying. One of them, the largest, reached up and adjusted some of the branches, reinforcing the structure. The others watched, and when the work was complete, they all sat down in a circle, and then they began to communicate. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it was clearly language. A complex series of sounds, grunts, whistles, and low rumbles that carried meaning. They were discussing something, planning something. Aiden was transfixed. "This is incredible," he whispered. "They have language, not just vocalizations, but true linguistic communication. This changes everything we know about hominid evolution." The creatures stayed in the clearing for almost an hour. When they left, they moved with purpose, heading deeper into the forest in single file. We retrieved the camera footage and spent the next week analyzing it frame by frame. Aiden brought in colleagues, sworn to secrecy, who specialized in linguistics and animal behavior. Their consensus was unanimous. These creatures possessed intelligence on par with, or possibly exceeding, that of early humans. "We're not talking about animals," Aiden explained in his report to Adam. "We're talking about a non-human species with culture, language, and social structures. They're hominids, possibly a surviving population of Gigantopithecus or perhaps a species we've never cataloged. But they're intelligent, and they deserve to be recognized as such." The revelation should have been a breakthrough, a moment of scientific triumph. But instead it opened up a Pandora's box of ethical, legal, and political questions. How do you tell the world that intelligent, potentially dangerous creatures have been living alongside humanity in secret? How do you protect both the creatures and the humans who share their territory? While these debates raged in government offices and university halls, I continued my patrols, and I noticed something changing in the forest. The creatures were becoming more visible, more bold. It was as if they knew they'd been discovered. And they were no longer hiding. Grayson and Jordan, 2 rangers patrolling the eastern boundary, reported a face-to-face encounter with a dogman creature that lasted over 20 minutes. The creature had stood on the trail, blocking their path, studying them. When they'd tried to go around it, the creature had moved to block them again. It was testing them, seeing how they would react. Ian and Carson found massive structures built along major hiking trails impossible to miss. It was a clear message. We are here and we want you to know it. The tension came to a head 3 months after my encounter with the intelligent creatures. A group of hunters, led by Axel and Jace, decided they were going to prove the existence of Bigfoot by killing one. They went into the desolation wilderness armed with high-powered rifles and tracking equipment. They never came back. When we found their campsite, it had been destroyed with a violence that was shocking. Trees were knocked down, the ground was torn up, and there was blood everywhere. We found Axel's body 2 days later. He'd been killed, not with animal savagery, but with what looked like deliberate execution. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, delivered with enough force to crush his skull. The message was clear. If you come into our territory with the intent to kill us, we will defend ourselves. Jace was found alive, barely 3 miles from the camp. He was catatonic, unable to speak, his eyes vacant. When he finally recovered enough to talk, his story was terrifying. "They didn't just attack us," he said. "They hunted us, like we were prey. They separated us, picked us off one by one. And the whole time they were communicating, coordinating their attack. They knew what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing." The incident forced the issue. Adam finally agreed that the truth had to come out, but it had to be done carefully, with proper preparation. A press conference was scheduled for December 15th. A coalition of scientists, rangers, and government officials would present the evidence, the photographs, the video footage, the physical samples, the eyewitness accounts. They would announce the existence of multiple cryptid species in the American wilderness and outline plans for their protection and study. I wasn't sure how the world would react. Fear, curiosity, denial, all of the above. But as I stood in the forest 3 days before the press conference, looking out at the dark trees, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, hope. Because for all the fear, all the death, all the terror, I'd also witnessed something remarkable. I'd seen evidence of another intelligent species, one that had survived hidden for centuries, adapting and enduring. I'd seen their art, their structures, their attempts at communication. They weren't monsters. They were neighbors, fellow inhabitants of this planet deserving of recognition and respect. As the sun set behind the trees, I heard it one final time, the howl of the dogman echoing through the forest. But this time I didn't hear menace. I heard something else, a declaration of existence, a proclamation that said, "We are here, we have always been here, and we will not be silent anymore." I stood there in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest, and I understood something fundamental. The American wilderness held secrets that we were only beginning to understand. The legends, the folklore, the stories whispered around campfires, they were all based on truth. The dogman, Bigfoot, the Wendigo, they were real. They had always been real, and now that we knew, now that we'd finally acknowledged their existence, everything would change. Whether that change would be for better or worse, only time would tell. But one thing was certain, the world would never be the same. My name is Alex. I'm a park ranger in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and this is my testimony. Every word is true. The creatures are real. The danger is real. But so is the wonder, the awe, the profound realization that we share this world with intelligences we're only beginning to understand. The shadows in the pines hold secrets. Some of those secrets are terrifying, but some of them are magnificent. And I'll keep watching those shadows, keep documenting those secrets for as long as I'm able, because someone needs to bear witness. Someone needs to tell the truth. This is my truth. This is my horror. This is my story, and it's not over yet. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I survived to tell this story, and that someone needs to know the truth about what stalks the forests of northern Michigan. I spent 7 years as a ranger in the Hiawatha National Forest, and for the first 5 of those years, I thought I understood the wilderness. I was wrong. It started in late October 3 years ago. The tourist season had ended, and the forest had settled into that eerie quiet that comes before winter truly takes hold. The aspens had already dropped their leaves, creating a carpet of gold that muffled every footstep. I was working the northern sector with my partner, a weathered ranger named Thomas Garrett, who'd been patrolling these woods for 23 years. "You ever hear anything strange out here at night?" Thomas asked me one evening as we sat in the ranger station, a small cabin about 15 miles from the nearest town. He was staring into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked. "Strange how?" I replied, looking up from my logbook. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed through the pines with a sound like breathing. Screams that don't sound like any animal you've learned about. Knocking sounds in the trees like someone's hitting them with a bat. Footsteps that are too heavy, too deliberate. I laughed it off then. Thomas had always struck me as the superstitious type, the kind of guy who grew up on campfire stories. "Probably just bears or elk," I said. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Yeah," he said finally. "Probably." 2 nights later, I heard it for the first time. I was doing a solo patrol along the Western Ridge Trail, checking the campsites to make sure no one had decided to brave the cold for some late-season camping. It was around 11 p.m. and my flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a knife through black water. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs. That's when I heard the scream. It started low, almost like a moan, then rose in pitch until it became a shriek that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was something caught between the two. Something that made every hair on my body stand on end and every instinct scream at me to run. I froze on the trail, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The scream echoed through the trees, bouncing off the trunks and seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When it finally faded, the silence that followed was somehow worse. The normal night sounds, the insects, the rustle of small animals, all of it had stopped. I keyed my radio with trembling fingers. "Thomas, you copy?" Static, then his voice calm and steady. "I copy. You okay? Did you hear that?" Another pause. "Yeah, I heard it. What the hell was it?" Could be a lot of things. But his voice had an edge to it now, a tension that told me he was lying. "Head back to the station. We'll check it out in the morning." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and started back down the trail, walking fast but not running. Some instinct told me that running would be a mistake, that there was something out there in the dark that would love to see me run. Every 50 feet or so, I'd hear a branch snap somewhere off to my left. Not in front of me, not behind me, but keeping pace with me in the trees. I'd stop and the sounds would stop. I'd walk and they'd start again. By the time I reached the station, I was drenched in sweat despite the cold. Thomas was standing on the porch, his rifle in his hands. He looked at my face and nodded slowly. "Welcome to the real North Woods," he said. The next morning arrived cold and gray, with a low fog hanging between the trees like curtains. Thomas and I headed back to where I'd heard the scream, both of us armed with rifles and high-powered flashlights, even though it was daylight. "You're going to see things you can't explain," Thomas said as we hiked. "The important thing is to stay calm and don't try to rationalize it. Your brain will try to make sense of it, try to turn it into something normal, but that's dangerous. You need to see it for what it is." "And what is it?" I asked. "Something that shouldn't exist, but does anyway." We found the tracks about 200 yards off the main trail, in a small clearing surrounded by birch trees. They were massive, easily 17 inches long and 7 inches wide, with 5 distinct toes and claw marks that had gouged deep furrows in the soft earth. They were shaped like human footprints but far too large, and they were spaced about 6 feet apart, suggesting whatever made them had a stride length that was simply impossible. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the other tracks that accompanied them. Mixed in with the massive footprints were prints that looked almost like dog tracks, except they were the size of dinner plates with claw marks that extended nearly 3 inches beyond the toe pads. These tracks moved on all fours, but occasionally showed impressions that suggested the creature had reared up on 2 legs. "2 of them," Thomas said quietly, crouching down to examine the prints. "The big one's been around these woods for as long as I've been a ranger. We call it the walker. The other one, the canine, that's newer, started showing up about 5 years ago." "What are they?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Thomas stood up and looked around the clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line. "The walker is what the old Ojibwe people called Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The other one, that's what some people call a dogman. And if they're both here, both in the same area, that's not good." "Why?"
"Because they're territorial."
"They don't usually hunt together or share space. If they're both here, it means something's driven them into the same area." He paused, his face grim. "Or something's calling them." We followed the tracks for nearly a mile, watching as they wound through the forest in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, almost like they were circling something. The trail led us to a small pond, maybe 50 feet across, its surface dark and still as glass. At the edge of the pond, we found the remains. A bull elk, easily 700 pounds, had been torn apart. Not killed cleanly like a bear or wolves would do, but demolished, ripped limb from limb with such violence that pieces of it were scattered across a 20-foot radius. The head had been twisted completely around, and deep gouges in the skull suggested something had tried to crack it open. The entire rib cage had been pulled apart, the ribs themselves snapped like twigs. But the most disturbing part was that the animal had been almost completely drained of blood. The ground around it should have been soaked, but instead it was just damp, like the blood had been methodically removed. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. Thomas knelt down by the carcass, his face pale. "This wasn't them," he said. "The walker and the dogman they kill to eat. This is something else. This is—" He trailed off, looking back toward the tree line. That's when we heard it. A series of knocks, 3 sharp raps against wood coming from somewhere deep in the forest. Then another 3 knocks from a different direction. Then another and another until the entire forest around us echoed with the sound of wood striking wood. "We need to go," Thomas said, standing up quickly. "Right now." We hurried back toward the trail, but the knocking followed us, always staying just out of sight, always keeping pace. Once I looked back and saw a massive shadow moving between the trees about 100 yards behind us. It was easily 8 feet tall and broad across the shoulders, moving with a fluid grace that no human could match. We didn't speak until we were back at the station, both of us breathing hard. Thomas immediately went to his office and pulled out a worn leather journal from a locked drawer. He opened it to reveal pages filled with handwritten notes, sketches, and what looked like maps marked with X's and dates. "I've been documenting the encounters for years," he said. Every ranger who's worked these woods knows about them, but we're told to keep quiet to avoid causing panic. But it's getting worse. More sightings, more aggressive behavior, more... He gestured helplessly at the journal. More of everything. I looked at the dates. The entries went back decades. Why hasn't anyone done anything? What are they going to do? Send in the National Guard to hunt for monsters? People would think we're crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy for the first 5 years I worked here. He flipped to a more recent page. But then you start seeing patterns. Disappearances that match up with sighting spikes. Livestock killings that can't be explained, and every few years some hiker or camper goes missing and never comes home. He showed me a list of names. Matthew Knowles, missing 2003. Ezra Hammond, missing 2007. Gabriel Torres, missing 2011. The list went on. 27 names in total, all people who had vanished without a trace in the Hiawatha National Forest over the past 30 years. What connects them? I asked. They were all last seen in the northern sector. Our sector. Thomas closed the journal and looked me in the eyes. And they all disappeared in late October or early November. A chill ran down my spine. What happens in late October? That's what I'm trying to figure out. But whatever it is, I think it's happening again this year, and I think it's going to be worse than ever before. 3 days passed without incident, but the tension in the station was unbearable. Thomas and I took turns on patrol, never going out alone, always armed. We saw more tracks, heard more knocking, but we never caught sight of whatever was making them. Then, on the 4th night, everything changed. I was sleeping when Thomas shook me awake, his face ashen in the lamplight. "We got a call," he said. A group of hunters at one of the camps up near Devil's Creek. They said something circling their cabin. Devil's Creek was at the northernmost edge of our sector, right up against the Canadian border. It was remote, accessible only by a rough logging road that took nearly an hour to traverse. By the time we arrived, it was close to midnight, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. The hunting cabin sat in a small clearing, a sturdy log structure with a covered porch and shuttered windows. 4 pickup trucks were parked outside, and I could see lights burning inside. As we pulled up, the door opened and 3 men emerged, all of them carrying rifles. The tallest one, a man with a gray beard and a weathered face, introduced himself as Carter Mitchell. "Thank God you're here," he said, his voice shaking. "We've been trapped in there for 6 hours. What happened?" Thomas asked. Carter gestured toward the tree line. "We were getting ready to turn in when we heard scratching on the walls. At first we thought it was a bear, maybe trying to get at our food. But then we saw it through the window." "Saw what?" He hesitated, looking at his companions, both of whom nodded encouragement. "A man. At least it looked like a man at first. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, just watching us. But it was wrong. Too tall, too thin. And its eye..." He shuddered. Its eyes glowed in the flashlight beam like a deer's eyes, but yellow. Bright yellow. Thomas and I exchanged glances. "How tall?" Thomas asked. 9 feet, maybe more, and skeletal like it was starving. Its skin was gray, almost white, and stretched so tight over its bones that you could see every rib, every vertebra. Carter's hands were shaking now, and the smell. Jesus Christ, the smell. Like rotting meat and disease, so strong it made us gag. I felt my stomach drop. I'd read about this in Thomas's journal, but seeing the terror in these men's eyes made it real in a way that words on a page never could. "Did it try to get in?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but his body language tense. It walked around the cabin, staying just at the edge of the light. It would stop at each window and just stare in, and we could hear it breathing, these long, rattling breaths. Then it started scratching at the logs, these long, slow scrapes that went on and on. Carter wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. The worst part was the voice. It spoke to us. What did it say? My name. It knew my name. Carter's voice broke. It said, "Carter, I'm so hungry, Carter, let me in. I'm so cold and so hungry." But the voice was wrong. Like multiple voices speaking at once, and it had this echo to it, like it was coming from somewhere far away and close by at the same time. Thomas grabbed my arm.
Get back in the truck now. What? Why?
"Because that's a Wendigo, and if it's talking, it's hunting." He turned to Carter and the other hunters. "Get in your trucks and follow us out. Don't stop for anything, don't slow down, and if you see anything in the road, you drive through it. Understand?" We loaded up and started the convoy back toward the main road. I drove while Thomas kept his rifle pointed out the window, his eyes scanning the darkness. For the first few miles, nothing happened. Then I saw them in the headlights, figures standing in the road ahead, 3 of them. They were impossibly tall and thin, their skin that same gray-white color Carter had described. As we got closer, I could see their faces, sunken cheeks, lipless mouths filled with broken teeth, and those eyes, those terrible yellow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. "Don't stop," Thomas said. I gripped the wheel and accelerated. At the last second, the figures moved, not stepping aside but leaping into the trees with an agility that shouldn't have been possible. I caught a glimpse of one in the side mirror, and it was following us, running alongside the truck with a loping, unnatural gait that covered ground impossibly fast. Behind us, one of the hunter's trucks swerved violently. I heard the crack of rifle fire, then screaming. In my rearview mirror, I saw one of the pickups veer off the road and slam into a tree. The other 2 trucks kept going, the drivers too terrified to stop. "Keep driving," Thomas yelled. "If we stop, we're all dead." I fought every instinct to go back, to help whoever had crashed, but I knew Thomas was right. The thing running alongside us suddenly appeared directly in front of the truck, and I swerved hard to avoid it. We fishtailed on the gravel road but stayed upright, and then we were back on the paved highway, the lights of the ranger station visible in the distance. We didn't stop until we were inside, doors locked, every light blazing. The 2 surviving trucks from the hunting party pulled up a few minutes later. Carter got out, his face streaked with tears. "Isaac and Jaden were in that truck," he said. "We have to go back for them." Thomas shook his head. "They're gone. If we go back now, we'll just be adding to the body count." "You don't know that. They could be hurt, they could need help." "I know exactly what happened to them," Thomas said, his voice hard. "And I know that if we go back there before sunrise, the same thing will happen to us." Carter wanted to argue, but something in Thomas's eyes stopped him. We spent the rest of the night in the station, all 5 of us armed and awake, watching the darkness beyond the windows. Every so often we'd hear scratching at the walls, soft and persistent like fingernails on wood. When dawn finally broke, Thomas and I drove back to the crash site with Carter. We found the truck wrapped around a tree, the driver's side door torn completely off its hinges. The interior was splattered with blood, but there were no bodies. What we did find were tracks. The massive footprints of the walker, the huge paw prints of the dogman, and the elongated, almost human tracks of the Wendigo, all converging on the crash site, and leading away from it, drag marks in the dirt heading north toward the deepest, darkest part of the forest. The next 72 hours were a nightmare. The Park Service tried to organize a search party for Isaac and Jaden, but Thomas and I both knew it was pointless. We'd seen enough to know what had happened to them, and no amount of search dogs or volunteers was going to change that. But we went through the motions anyway, leading teams of locals and law enforcement through the forest, always staying in large groups, always armed. We found scattered pieces of clothing, a boot, a rifle with the barrel bent nearly in half. We found more tracks, always the same 3 types, always seeming to circle us no matter which direction we went. On the second day of the search, a volunteer named Luca disappeared. One minute he was there, walking at the back of the group, and the next he was gone. We backtracked and found the place where he'd vanished. A small depression in the earth where the soil was disturbed, and a single massive handprint pressed into the mud. The print was easily twice the size of a human hand, with long skeletal fingers that ended in claw-like nails. The search was called off that afternoon. The official explanation was dangerous conditions, but everyone knew the truth. Something in the forest was hunting us, and we were losing. That night, back at the station, Thomas showed me the oldest entries in his journal. They were written by a ranger named Anthony Preston, who had worked the northern sector in the 1970s. His handwriting was shaky, deteriorating over the course of the entries until the final pages were almost illegible. October 28, 1974, Thomas read aloud. "The 3 have converged. The walker in the west, the dogman in the east, the Wendigo coming down from the north. They've formed a triangle around something in the heart of the forest. I can feel it calling to them, and God help me, I can feel it calling to me too." He turned the page. November 1st, 1974. Dylan and Lincoln are dead. We found pieces of them scattered across 3 miles of forest. Whatever is at the center of that triangle, it's feeding. The calls are getting louder every night. I can hear them in my sleep now. They're not words exactly, but I understand them anyway. They're promises of power, of immortality, of hunger that's both curse and blessing. The final entry was dated November 3rd, 1974. The handwriting was wild, almost violent, the pen tearing through the paper in places. I understand now. It's not three separate creatures. They're all servants of something older, something that lives in the deepest parts of the forest where even the trees are afraid to grow. It wakes up every few decades, feeds, then sleeps again. And it's waking up now. I can feel it. God forgive me, I want to go to it. I want to see it. The entry ended there. Thomas flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. Anthony Preston was found dead in his cabin on November 5th, 1974. Official cause of death was a heart attack, but the other rangers who found him said he died with his eyes open, staring at something they couldn't see, and he was smiling. I felt cold despite the fire crackling in the wood stove. What do we do? We have two choices. We can run, get as far away from here as possible and let whatever happens happen, or we can go find the center of that triangle and destroy whatever's there. How do you destroy something we don't even understand? Thomas pulled out a metal case from under his desk and opened it to reveal 4 emergency flares, a can of gasoline, and several road flares. Fire. Everything alive is afraid of fire. Even monsters. You're talking about burning down part of the national forest. I'm talking about saving lives. How many more people have to die before we act? I thought about Isaac and Jaden, about Luca, about all the names in that journal. When do we go? Tonight. It has to be tonight. November 3rd, same date as Anthony's last entry. Whatever cycle this thing operates on, tonight is the peak. We spent the rest of the day preparing, loading gear into backpacks, checking our weapons, trying not to think too hard about what we were about to do. As the sun set, painting the sky blood red, we set out into the forest one last time. Thomas had marked the center of the triangle on a map, using the locations of sightings and encounters to triangulate the position. It was about 8 miles from the station, in an area that wasn't accessible by any trail. We'd have to bushwhack our way through some of the densest forest in the sector. The night was eerily silent as we hiked, our flashlights cutting narrow tunnels through the darkness. No insects, no birds, not even the wind, just the sound of our boots on the forest floor and our own breathing. After about 3 hours, we heard the knocking. It started ahead of us, 3 sharp raps echoing through the trees. Then it came from behind us, then from both sides until we were surrounded by the sound. Thomas pulled out his rifle and we stood back to back, spinning slowly to watch all directions at once. That's when I saw it for the first time. The walker. It emerged from between 2 massive pine trees, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. It stood at least 8.5 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair that was matted with burrs and pine needles. Its face was a horrifying blend of human and ape, with deep-set eyes that reflected our flashlight beams with an intelligent gleam. Its hands, hanging past its knees, ended in thick fingers that looked capable of crushing bone. It tilted its head, studying us, then opened its mouth and made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a whisper. The smell hit me a second later, a powerful musk that made my eyes water. "Don't shoot," Thomas said quietly. "Not unless it charges." The walker took a step toward us and I heard another sound, this time from our right. A deep, rumbling growl that made my blood freeze. The dogman stepped into view, and I understood immediately why people who saw it were never the same afterward. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall even on all fours, with the muscular build of a wolf. But the proportions were all wrong. Its head was too large, its snout too short, and when it reared up onto its hind legs, it stood like a man, its front paws morphing into something almost hand-like. Its eyes were yellow, intelligent, and filled with a hunger that was almost palpable. "Thomas," I whispered, "what do we do?" "We keep moving slowly toward the center. They're not stopping us. They're hurting us." He was right. As we started walking again, the walker and the dogman paced us, staying about 30 feet away, occasionally making sounds to each other that seemed almost like communication. They were driving us toward something and we had no choice but to go. After another mile, the forest changed. The trees became twisted, their trunks spiraling in ways that nature didn't intend. The ground became soft and spongy, and I realized we were walking on a carpet of dead vegetation that hadn't decayed properly, just compressed and turned gray. The air itself felt wrong, thick and heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. Then we saw it. The Wendigo. It was standing in the center of a circular clearing, lit by a strange phosphorescent glow that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was even more horrible than Carter had described. A skeletal nightmare that stood nearly 10 feet tall, its skin stretched so tight over its bones that it looked like walking anatomy lesson. But it was the face that made me want to scream, completely lipless, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp, and those eyes, those terrible yellow eyes that seemed to look directly into my soul and see every sin, every dark thought, every moment of weakness I'd ever had. And behind it, growing out of the earth like some obscene tumor, was something I still don't have words to describe. It looked almost like a massive cocoon, easily 20 feet across and pulsing with a sickly yellow-green light. Veins of the same light spread out from it across the forest floor, and I realized that the twisted trees, the dead ground, everything wrong about this place radiated from this thing. The Wendigo spoke, and its voice was exactly as Carter had described. Multiple voices at once, echoing from far away and right next to us simultaneously. "You've come to stop the awakening. How noble, how futile. What are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We are what remains when humans give in to the deepest hunger, the darkest urges. We are what waits in the spaces between survival and civilization. We are old, older than your species' memory, and we will be here long after you're gone." Thomas raised his rifle. "Maybe, but tonight you burn." The Wendigo laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think your human fire can hurt what feeds on despair? What draws strength from fear? Look around you, Ranger. Do you see the walker? Do you see the dogman? They serve the old power just as we do, just as you will when you finally understand." That's when Thomas threw the first flare. The flare hit the cocoon dead center, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the thing began to shriek, a sound so terrible it felt like my skull was going to crack from the pressure. The Wendigo stumbled backward, its skeletal hands clutching at its face, and I realized that whatever was in that cocoon, it was connected to the Wendigo somehow, maybe even controlling it. "Now!" Thomas shouted, and I threw my flare too, followed by the road flares. The cocoon caught fire quickly, the flames spreading along those glowing veins that crisscrossed the clearing. The light changed from sickly yellow-green to angry orange-red, and the shrieking intensified. The walker and the dogman suddenly charged, abandoning their calm observation and coming at us with terrifying speed. Thomas shot the dogman first, catching it in the shoulder, and the creature went down but scrambled back up immediately, blood streaming from the wound. I fired at the walker, but my shot went wide, and the massive creature was on me before I could chamber another round. Its hands wrapped around my shoulders, and I was lifted off the ground like I weighed nothing. Its face was inches from mine, and I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the awareness. This wasn't a mindless beast. This was something that understood exactly what it was doing, but then it hesitated. It turned its head to look at the burning cocoon, and I saw something in its expression that looked almost like relief. It set me down carefully, almost gently, then turned and walked toward the fire. The dogman did the same, limping on 3 legs, ignoring Thomas entirely. They stood at the edge of the flames, watching the cocoon burn, and as the fire consumed it, they began to change. The walker's posture shifted, becoming less human, more ape-like. The dogman dropped to all fours and stayed there, looking more like an oversized wolf than the hybrid horror it had been. Even the Wendigo was changing, its skeletal frame filling out slightly, becoming less monstrous and more like a human who had simply starved to death. "Whatever that thing was," Thomas said, standing beside me, "it had a hold on them. It was making them worse, more aggressive, more evil." The cocoon collapsed in on itself, the fire consuming the last of it, and with its destruction came a wave of something I can only describe as release. The pressure in the air, the wrongness that had permeated the clearing, it all lifted. The twisted trees seemed to straighten slightly. The dead ground under our feet felt more solid, more real. The Wendigo spoke one last time, its voice now singular, human, filled with a pain that was almost unbearable to hear. "Thank you. We've been trapped in hunger for so long, so terribly long. Now we can finally—" It didn't finish the sentence. It simply fell forward, its body hitting the ground and immediately beginning to decay, aging years and seconds until it was nothing but bones, then dust, then nothing at all. The walker and the dogman turned to look at us one final time. The walker nodded, A distinctly human gesture, then turned and walked into the forest, moving away from us with steady, deliberate steps. The dogman tilted its head, studying us with eyes that now seemed more curious than hungry, then followed the walker into the darkness. Thomas and I stood in the clearing for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers. Finally, Thomas spoke. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We need to burn this whole area, make sure nothing grows here. Nothing can use this place." We used the gasoline and the remaining flares to start a controlled burn, one that would look like a natural forest fire to the investigators who would inevitably come. Then we hiked back to the station in silence, both of us too exhausted and traumatized to speak. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming nearly 100 acres of forest. The official report called it a lightning strike, even though there hadn't been a storm in weeks. No one questioned it too hard. The important thing was that it stopped. The disappearances stopped too. The strange sounds, the knocking, the screams in the night, all of it ended. The northern sector became just another piece of forest, beautiful and dangerous in the normal ways that wilderness is dangerous, but nothing more. Thomas retired a month later. He gave me his journal and told me to keep documenting, to keep watching just in case. "There are old things in the world," he said. "Things that predate our civilization, our understanding. Most of them stay hidden, stay away from us. But sometimes they wake up, and when they do, someone needs to be ready." I spent another 2 years as a ranger in the Hiawatha National Forest, always watching, always listening. I never saw the walker or the dogman again, but sometimes on very quiet nights I'd hear footsteps in the distance, too heavy to be human but moving with purpose and intelligence. And sometimes I'd find massive tracks in the snow, leading deep into the forest before vanishing as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist. I'm writing this now because I'm leaving the Park Service. I'm done with the forest, done with the secrets it holds, but someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand that the stories we tell around campfires, the legends that make us shiver and laugh, they're not all fiction. Some of them are warnings, passed down through generations, telling us to respect the darkness and the things that live in it. The Wendigo was real. Bigfoot is real. The Dogman is real. They're not the monsters we imagine in stories, though. They're something more complex, more tragic. They're cursed to exist in the spaces between human and animal, between hunger and satisfaction, between life and death. And sometimes something even older and more terrible takes control of them, uses them, makes them into weapons of fear and death. That's the real horror. Not that monsters exist, but that they can be used, corrupted, made into something even worse than they already are. I found out later what that cocoon was, after doing months of research into ancient folklore and talking to elders from the Ojibwe tribes that once inhabited the area. They called it the heart of hunger, a physical manifestation of pure, undiluted want. It appeared every few decades, drawn to places where the veil between the natural and supernatural was thin. It would call to the creatures of the forest, the ones that already existed in that gray area between myth and reality, and it would amplify their worst natures, turn them into killing machines. The tribes used to perform rituals to prevent it from manifesting, but those traditions had been lost over time, forgotten in the march of modernity. We'd almost paid the ultimate price for that forgetting. I still have Thomas's journal. Sometimes I flip through it, reading the accounts of other rangers, other encounters. There are dozens of them scattered across the years. Brief windows into a world most people never see and wouldn't believe if they did. And sometimes, late at night, I add my own entries, documenting the things I saw and the things I learned, because someday another ranger will work the northern sector. And someday, if we're not careful, if we let our guard down, something old and hungry might wake again. When that happens, someone needs to know what to do. Someone needs to understand the truth. The wilderness is not empty. It's not just trees and animals and clean air. It's alive in ways we don't understand. And it holds secrets that would drive most people mad if they knew them. The forest doesn't care about us, doesn't hate us or love us, but there are things in the forest that do care, that watch us and wait, and we need to remember that we're not always at the top of the food chain. I learned that lesson the hard way. I survived, but Isaac and Jaden didn't. Luca didn't. Matthew, Ezra, Gabriel, and all the others whose names fill that journal, they didn't. They paid the price for our arrogance, our assumption that we understood and controlled nature. So this is my warning. Written down so that someone somewhere will know the truth. When you go into the deep woods, when you venture far from the trails and the campsites and the safety of civilization, remember that you're entering another world. Be respectful, be aware. And if you hear knocking in the trees, if you see eyes reflecting your flashlight beam, if you smell that terrible musk of something that shouldn't exist, don't investigate. Don't try to explain it away. Just leave because the forest has teeth and not all of them belong to bears and wolves. Some of them belong to things older, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous. Things that were here before us and will be here long after we're gone. Things that we in our comfortable modern world have forgotten how to respect or fear. I remember them, and I'll never forget. My name was Park Ranger at the Hiawatha National Forest Northern Sector, and this is my testimony. I survived the convergence of November 2022, and I'm writing this so that others might survive the next one. Stay out of the deep woods in late October. Trust your instincts when they tell you to run. And never ever assume you're alone just because you can't see anything watching you. The forest is always listening, and sometimes it listens back.